Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Again, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Happy warm sunny Tuesday here in Minnesota. The spring is here. I saw lilacs blooming already, so it's like officially arrived. That's my metric. My name is Anna Hall. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the project lead for the Minnesota Justice Research Center's project on pretrial best practices in Minnesota. We are really excited to be here to talk with you about our findings from our report. The title of this presentation is the same as the title of our report, Towards Safety, Liberty, and Equity, a Community-Centered Framework for Redesigning Minnesota's Pretrial System. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we got where we are, and then a little bit about what our findings and recommendations are. And then we're going to break out into small groups to take a closer look at some of our findings and have some conversation about those findings. A lot of that small group work is going to be talking about the ways that we came to our recommendations using community input. So I see some folks in the room who either attended or volunteered at community engagement sessions, so welcome back. I also see some folks that we interviewed from the system actor sides. We appreciate your work with us on that, and thanks for coming back to learn about what we landed on. I'm going to have the other members of the MNJRC team introduce themselves quickly, and then we'll move into the presentation portion. So Kayla, why don't you go ahead?
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kayla Richards, and she, her works for me, and I am the Director of Community Impact. Mabel?
Hi, everyone. I'm Mabel Malhotra. She, her also works for me, and I'm the Communications Manager. Katie?
Afternoon. My name is Katie Remington Cunningham. I'm the Research Director here at the Minnesota Justice Research Center. It's nice to see names that I recognize and some faces. So welcome, everyone. I will be also manning the chat. So if folks have questions, and I'll be dropping some resources in there as we go, feel free to do so. Thanks so much. And I'll kick it to our other Anna.
Hi, I'm Anna Simonton. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a research assistant on this pretrial project with the MNJRC.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So just a couple of reminders while we're virtual. If you would keep your microphone on mute unless you're intentionally unmuting to jump in with a question, which is welcome. Just please keep yourself on mute. Feel free to have your video on or off during this portion. Obviously, when we break up into the smaller groups to have more discussion, it will be helpful to have your video on so that the folks in your in your breakout room know who you are and can see your face. If you're not comfortable with that, that's fine, but we welcome your engagement in that space as much as possible. You can use the chat for questions. Jump in with questions, raise a hand if you have those, and then we'll also have time for questions at the end. So just a little bit of background on the project. We were asked to do this study by the Minnesota Legislature. We started the project in October 2023 and spent about 18 months studying this, which felt really long at the time, but we've heard from folks around the country who've done studies like this that we really got a lot done in a short period of time, and so we're excited to share with you what we did. During that time, we did community listening sessions all around the state. We did system actor interviews with over 40 folks who work in the system, pretrial practitioners, defense attorneys, prosecutors, judges. We did site visits to other states as well, so specifically Illinois and New Jersey, both of whom have transformed their pretrial systems pretty dramatically, and then also to smaller jurisdictions, counties in Indiana and Wisconsin, and in Minnesota to study their pretrial services. And then we read up on all the best literature, all the other research happening around the country all the time on this issue, and conducted some legal analysis as well. We issued 2 reports. Our first report was last February, and in that report, we recommended that Minnesota create a data infrastructure for pretrial practices. Basically, what's happening in the pretrial system what, how many people are paying bail every year? What amounts are they paying it at? What are the results of that? So we recommended that system be created. And then our final report was issued this February, and that's really what we're going to dig into today. I like to start all of these presentations by just defining what we mean when we say pretrial. For some folks, it's obvious. For others, we've never heard the word before. So when we're talking about pretrial, we're talking about the entire period of time between an arrest or a citation for a criminal offense and the resolution of the case. So whether that's, a dismissal, a trial, a verdict at trial, some sort of plea agreement, that entire period is what we're calling the pretrial period. And during that time, people can be out in the community, or they may be in custody in their local jail, depending on what conditions are set on them and whether they are able to afford their bail amount. I also like to define the word bail because it's one that has kind of two different meanings. We use one sort of popularly now when we talk about it, but there's another more historical meaning that's really helpful for understanding where we're at right now in Minnesota on using cash bail and what our pretrial practices. So nowadays, I think most folks understand that bail means monetary conditions, means cash bail, the amount of money that you pay in order to be released from custody during the pretrial period. But legally and historically, bail meant that whole process of release. So that might include monetary conditions, might include a cash bail amount, but also often includes other types of conditions. And so that when we say bail from a legal sense, what we mean is that whole decision around release and how someone is released. And the reason that's important is because of what Minnesota's Constitution says. It says that all people are bailable in Minnesota. And what that means is that pretrial release is an absolute right here. There is no mechanism in Minnesota right now for a judge to say, I'm just going to keep this person in before trial. They have to either release them on their own recognizance, meaning with no conditions other than to stay law-abiding, or they have to set conditions, often which include a bail amount. So, when people talk about why did that judge let that person out, or how did they get out after doing that thing, in Minnesota, there's just simply no way to do detention other than to set a very high bail that someone cannot afford. So I'm going to jump into some of our findings here before we move into recommendations. This is our analysis of the Minnesota jail population from 2017, the beginning of 2017 through the end of 2023. What we found was that a daily average jail population in Minnesota was about 5,500. And of that group, about 56%, so around 3,000 people, were being held pre-trial. So the pre-trial, as I said, these are people who, their case is not resolved yet. It's ongoing in some way. Other could be, someone is serving a sentence in jail. It could be someone is being held for the, a federal official. There's lots of other reasons why someone might be in jail without being pre-trial. But we found that over half of our jail population is pre-trial here. We looked at how long people are spending in jail during the pretrial period. We found that about half of that pretrial population spends a day or less in jail. So those are the folks that are probably getting arrested, booked into jail one day and released the next, or even booked and released within the same day. But the other half of the pretrial population spends more than a week detained. So we're seeing a pretty big split, and that can make it difficult to understand, what's the average that somebody spends in jail pre-trial in Minnesota. And that's why we broke it down into these two categories. One is a pretty quick book and release within a day or two. The other is a pretty sizable amount, a week or more. Okay. We also looked at where people are being held pretrial and for how long. What this graph shows is that folks in greater Minnesota, particularly in the north of Minnesota, in counties that overlap with Native American reservations, and then also a couple of counties in the south of Minnesota, you're seeing people stay for long periods of time, longer than anywhere else in the state. And we also mapped out the racial disparities of Minnesota's pretrial system. So what we're seeing here, and I can sort of read it out. We will take a look at this graph again later in the small groups. But that's the in Minnesota. So we're looking at daily pretrial population by race. So what you're seeing is that Indigenous people are dramatically disproportionately incarcerated pretrial in Minnesota. The second line down is for Black Minnesotans. And so again, compared to Indigenous folks, slightly less disproportionate, but still significantly higher than the bottom two lines, which are Asian and Pacific Islander and white. So we're seeing, in terms of rates of pretrial detention, very high rates for Indigenous and Black Minnesotans. We looked at the effects of the current system. Some of this is based on what we heard from community members in our listening session. Some of this is based on what the literature says around the country. What we see is that people who are held pre-trial are more likely to plead guilty. They're more likely, if they get convicted, to get jail or prison time as part of their sentence. They receive longer sentences. And then obviously they are at risk for losing jobs, losing housing, losing public benefits while they're in custody. And I will just say, for these first three bullets here, pleading guilty, jail or prison time, and longer sentences, this is compared to a similar person who's released pretrial. So two people, kind of apples to apples, similar criminal histories, similar charge that they're facing. One person, the person who is detained, is going to have worst case outcomes. And we can pretty much isolate that down to because they're being detained. We also looked at the impact of the current system on victim survivors. So what we heard, especially in our community engagement sessions, was that victim survivors are afterthoughts and are largely ignored throughout the course of the criminal legal processes in Minnesota. We also heard that many victim survivors are actually the ones who are paying the bails, and that's really a burden for them and for their families. Often somebody needs the other parent or partner to be contributing to the household, and so they're put in a tough position when that person is in custody. Victim survivors reported to us that they lack agency in the process, so they don't always get, they ask for certain things and it's not, that's not always given to them. They make their views known and those are not always honored by folks who are working within the system. And then they reported also inconsistent communication and updates regarding the case. So sometimes victim survivors are receiving consistent updates about, when there are court hearings, what happens at each hearing, but often they're not. And that's particularly true at the very beginning of a case when, there's a pretrial hearing to determine conditions, somebody gets released and the victim survivor is not always being notified of that. Before I jump into recommendations, any questions? I see there's one in the chat.
Anna, just double check my response.
Yeah, so our data on pretrial did not include people who were being held on probation violation holds.
So those would be in the 44%, the other.
Correct.
Correct. Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I just had a question on that 56%.
Sure.
Did it include new arrests, pretrial violations, both, or did it not distinguish why they were in custody, just that they were pretrial?
We couldn't distinguish between that just based on the data that we had. We were just looking at new arrests reported to the Department of Corrections. Well, so we weren't able to track if they were during a pretrial release period already.
Well, so that's actually my question. So new arrest in my world means somebody that has a first appearance on a complaint or a charge.
Yep.
But if it's a pretrial violation, they could be 6 months or a year into the process. That's different than somebody who's being first seen. So that's why I wondered if that distinction, but it sounds like you weren't able to do that, that the information you had was from one source that gave you just kind of the component about the in custody credit, for want of a better way of saying it. Does that sound right?
Yeah, so the data that we got from the Department of Corrections was every person who was booked into any jail in Minnesota over the course of these 6 years, their booking and release dates. So that's the data that we were able to use to analyze. And so we couldn't really break it down by, we could give our best guesses at somebody, we know someone was arrested 6 months ago and they maybe have a charge, but based on just the DOC data, we don't know whether every arrest is charged out or not. So we're really just going off of what the bookings tell us.
So the data that you received were from the bookings or from DOC data about the person? Because bookings would be the new charge. I'm not trying to split hairs, but it does matter to me because there's pretrial violation wouldn't be booking data necessarily. That would be on a warrant. Booking happens on first appearance.
So anytime someone is booked into the jail, that's recorded and reported to the DOC.
I see. It's a term being used for every time their intake happens into a jail for any reason.
Correct.
Understood. Thank you for that.
Yep.
Okay.
And I see someone was arrested on post conviction. Gwen, could you clarify that question? I don't know if you want
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
So it's fairly common for somebody to, for example, the PV, if you have a probation violation, that's frequently associated with a new charge. So you're arrested on 2 things. Does that get counted as part of one group or the other, or is it by case? So I guess is the data by case or by individual?
Both. The data that came to us was, the booking. So the individual booked and then the charges on which they were booked. So sometimes there were multiple charges on which they were booked, and we combined those charges into a single data point. So in a situation where somebody is, has a probation violation and an additional charge on top of that, that would have counted as like part of the pretrial population.
Okay, that goes back to my question because that could skew the data because if you're held on a pretrial or if you're held on a violation, especially probation or pretrial, and then you get a new charge, if you're held on the probation violation, then there's no reason to post bail, but often our judges will place a bail on that person. So 25,000 unconditional, 5,000 or 10,000 conditional, and then they also have the probation, but then they're held on the probation hold. So now you're increasing that amount of time in your data that they're being held on the pretrial, even though they never would have been released because of the probation violation.
Yeah, so I mean, just to be clear, the data that we have access to is not court system data. So anything that happened after a person was booked into the jail, we weren't able to access that data in part because of the court's restrictions around data access. So what we were able to get access to was data from the Department of Corrections regarding people who were booked into the jail and how long they spent there. So, we did, our best to clean up the data and make educated decisions about what to filter out and what to leave in. If somebody was booked in on just a probation violation, they were removed from the data. And so that may be what's happening with a lot of those folks is they're booked in on the probation violation. If they're booked in on a new charge and being held for longer, it's possible that those folks are part of the 56% for our data.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and I certainly not a criticism of your
No,
work.
no,
It's just yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate
feel
the
like it would
question.
be
And it
helpful
is,
to the legislature to understand and then find a way to authorize access to that data for research purposes because, having, more data on this would be really helpful to know exactly, where and then we could look at better outliers and stuff. And I think clearly the greater Minnesota data, regardless of that, is going to be showing disparities.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. And honestly, this discussion brings up why we made the recommendation in our first report that we did, which is that it's very difficult to get data that is clear about what is happening in the pretrial system, who's being held and when and why and for how long. It's really, and we spent quite a long time digging into this data and trying to get what we could out of it. If people have additional questions about, I'm not a quantitative analyst, so I've given you basically the limit of what I know. I'm happy to connect you with the person on our team who did the data analysis, who is, brilliant with that stuff. But if this is something that you support, that you want to know more about, there has been an effort at the legislature to get this data infrastructure built. So there's a bill in front of the legislature right now that I would encourage folks to look into and support. I'm going to move into our recommendations so we can go into small groups in just a minute. Our first recommendation is to expand law enforcement's ability to cite and release rather than arrest and detain. So typically, there's two options when an officer arrives at in a situation where they think that a crime may have been committed. They can arrest a person, take them back to jail and book them in. They can also issue a citation and release them at the scene with requirement to come back at a later date for court. What we found is that this cite and release process is used inconsistently across the state. It's not codified in statute. It's really mostly in the court rules. And statute would help to clarify that and then also reduce inequities between when it's being used and where. One example that we saw of this was in New Jersey, and decisions about whether to cite and release or to arrest and detain happen with the assistance of prosecutors. So if a law enforcement officer wants to cite and release someone at the scene rather than detain them, they can contact prosecutors to ask, is this an acceptable situation in which to do that? And that has, based on our conversations with prosecutors in New Jersey, have been a really effective way to increase the use of cite and release there. We're also recommending that there be a guaranteed right to counsel at all bail hearings in Minnesota. Most folks who practice in the metro or who have observed court in the Twin Cities metro area probably know that the bail hearings are staffed. So there's a public defender typically for every defendant at a bail hearing. But we did observe when we went to greater Minnesota that not all places in Minnesota have that guarantee. And there's no requirement at this point in law that happen. So we recommend that the legislature adopt this right to counsel. The first appearance in court is a really important moment in the case. It's often very quick and yet has ramifications that play out through the whole course of the case. And then there is a benefit really, to the defendant, obviously, of having someone speak on their behalf, but also to the system as a whole. When a defendant has an advocate, that person can provide more information to the court more clearly and more quickly than a defendant may be able to do on their own behalf. And so that enables the court to make more informed decisions. Our third recommendation is maybe the most complicated, and we'll have some more time to talk about it in small groups, but the recommendation is to create what we're calling an intentional release and detain system that doesn't use cash bail. So this is a chart of what that system can look like. In an intentional release and detain system, there are two categories of charges: charges that are not eligible for detention and charges that are eligible for detention. That decision about which charges fall into which bucket is a policy decision. It's a legislative decision. And so we have some research guidance on that in our report, but we don't go so far as to say which should fall into which bucket. But we do go so far as to say most charges shouldn't be eligible for detention. Those people would be released sometimes with conditions, sometimes without, but they simply would not be eligible to be detained pretrial. And then there would be a smaller set of charges that would be eligible for detention. But that doesn't mean that those people charged with those offenses would be automatically held during the pretrial period. They would have a hearing to decide whether they should be detained or not. This is the kind of system that provides off-ramps for people throughout the process. So if a charge is not eligible for detention, that's one way that we divert people from the jails back into the community. The prosecutor in this system would also have to make a motion to detain someone. So if a person comes into the prosecutor's office, they've been charged with an offense that makes them, they could be detained pretrial, the prosecutor still has to look at the case and decide, is this person really, do they need to be detained? And they may decide not to move for detention, in which case that's also going to divert them from the jails. And then, of course, if the prosecutor moves for detention, the judge still has to decide, is this a case where detention is appropriate? So what ends up happening, and what we saw when we were in Illinois and New Jersey, is that these are more careful decisions being made about who is detained and who is not. And it also eliminates the use of money as a way to detain people. Our fourth recommendation is to use what are called least restrictive conditions. So the idea is there's two main goals during the pretrial period. One is to ensure that the person comes back for their court appearances, and the other is to make sure that the community safety is upheld during that period of time. Least restrictive conditions just means what's going to ensure appearance and ensure community safety with the least restriction on the defendant's liberty. This is a period of time where the person is presumed innocent. And so what can we do to meet these goals while also meeting the goal of honoring liberty? So this would tailor conditions to individual circumstances more clearly, use evidence-based conditions. So we go into it in our report a little bit, but there are conditions that are used pretty regularly right now in Minnesota and across the country, like drug testing, that are often that studies don't find are effective for ensuring appearance and community safety. And then it reduces the financial waste and time waste, both for the defendant potentially, but then also probation, who's monitoring the conditions, the kind of programs that defendants often are required to engage in during the pretrial period. If they're not effective, then we shouldn't be spending money on it. Our fifth recommendation is to create pretrial services organizations to provide support to defendants during the pretrial process. So right now, there's not every county has a pretrial services agency. Some of the larger counties do, but in many places there are no supports for people during the pretrial period. And a pretrial services organization would provide a kind of partnership and support to help the person move through the pretrial process. So they would supply information to the court, help the court understand the person's history and background. They would conduct needs assessments to help identify what defendants might need during the pretrial period to be successful. Connect people with mental health resources, housing resources as needed, and also provide court reminders, rides to court, other things that help make sure the person appears in court. And what pretrial services organizations are really designed to do is, rather than punishing someone for failing during the pretrial period, it's ensuring success ahead of time so that the process continues to move forward and the case can be resolved in a timely manner without further issues. So this is just an example of what a pretrial services organization sort of hub might look like, as a place to go to help connect with and track the engagement with job training, counseling, housing assistance, employment assistance.
I just want to say first that we appreciate you being here today so much, and our main room will be recorded. Please give us your feedback on your experience today. That helps us think about, how we host these conversations. And then tap in as well to the MNJRC so you can sort of stay in touch with, the latest happenings. I'm going to pass it back to Anna for just a 1-minute closeout. But before we do, I want to say folks really came prepared to have good conversation. There were a lot of good questions. You all were really thoughtful and intentional. And so it was nice to hear so much about some of the complexity of our system. And I'm grateful for all the work that you do. Anna, you want to close this out?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. There's been a lot of links in the chat. We will send a follow-up email with attachments, the slides and posters. If you have specific questions about our recommendations, feel free to reach out to anyone on the team. You can see my address up here. It's just anna@mnjrc.org. And if I can't answer it, we'll get it on to the right person. But we certainly welcome any feedback you have to our recommendations about this event. And we invite you also to get tapped in with the MNJRC. We have a newsletter that goes out pretty regularly. We're on socials. So you can stay up to date about how these recommendations are being taken and put into practice. So thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time and attention and willingness to engage on this. We literally can't do it without community. So thank you and have a great rest of your afternoon.